While making war upon the Assyrians, David is represented as being on friendly terms with Hamath. Toi, king of Hamath, in fact, sent his son Joram to David with presents, because he had fought against Hadadezer and smitten him, for Hadadezer had wars with Toi. 2 Samuel 18. Now Hamath turns out to have been a Hittite kingdom, and the Hittites and Assyrian neighbours belonged to different races, and were continually engaged in war. It was therefore natural that Toi should have made alliance with David, who had broken the power of the common enemy. This alliance between Hamath and Judah must have lasted down to the time when Hamath was reduced by Sargon and became an Assyrian dependency. Tiglath-Pileser too informs us that Uzziah of Judah was the ally of Yahubidhi or Jehobihad, king of Hamath. This explains a passage of the scripture 2 Kings 14:28, which has long presented a difficulty, though the difficulty is now seen to have been due to our own ignorance, and to be really a striking confirmation of the truth of the inspired record. When it is said that Jeroboam too recovered Hamath, which was allied with Judah for Israel, we are supplied with the middle link of a chain which begins with the embassy of Toi to David and ends with the alliance between Uzziah and Yahubidhi. It is noticeable that Yahubidhi and Joram, the son of Toi, are the only Gentiles known to us whose names are compounded with that of the God of Israel. It now only remains to point out how recent discoveries, prior to this book being written and published, have shown that writing was known and practiced in Judah at the time to which the larger part of the Old Testament scriptures professes to belong. There have been two discoveries which more especially make this clear. These are the discoveries of the Moabite stone and the Siloam inscription. The Moabite stone was a monument erected by Mesha, the contemporary of Ahab, who is called a sheep master in 2 Kings 3:4. It is consequently as old as the 9th century before the Christian era, and was discovered in 1869 by Mr. Klein, a German missionary, among the ruins of the ancient Dibon. Owing to an unfortunate dispute for the possession of the stone, it was broken into pieces by the Arabs, though not until after some imperfect squeezes of it had been made. Most of the fragments have since been recovered and fitted together, but the concluding lines are still missing. A translation of the text will show how historically important it is. I, Mesha, am the son of Chemoshgad, king of Moab, the Dibonite. My father reigned over Moab 30 years, and I reigned after my father. And I erected this stone to Chemosh at Kirha, a stone of salvation. For he saved me from all the spoilers, and made me see my desire upon all my enemies, even upon Omri, king of Israel. Now they afflicted Moab many days, for Chemosh was angry with his land. His son succeeded him, and he also said, I will afflict Moab. In my days, Chemosh said, let us go, and I will see my desire upon him and his house, and I will destroy Israel with an everlasting destruction. Now Omri took the land of Medeba, and the enemy occupied it in his days, and in the days of his son 40 years. And Chemosh had mercy on it in my days, and I fortified Baal Meon, and I made therein the tank, and I fortified Kiriathaim. For the men of God dwelt in the land of Ataroth from of old, and the king of Israel fortified for himself Ataroth. And I assaulted the wall and captured it, and killed all the warriors of the wall for the well-pleasing of Chemosh and Moab. And I removed from it all the spoil, and offered it before Chemosh in Kirjath. And I placed there in the men of Siran and the men of Mokrath. And Chemosh said to me, Go, take Nebo against Israel. And I went in the night, and I fought against it from the break of dawn till noon, and I took it and slew in all 7,000 men, but I did not kill the women and maidens, for I devoted them to Ashtar Chemosh. And I took from it the vessels of Yahweh, or Jehovah, and offered them before Chemosh. And the king of Israel fortified Jahaz and occupied it when he made war against me, and Chemosh drove him out before me, and I took from Moab 200 men, all its poor, and placed them in Jahaz, has, and took it to annex it to Devon. I built Kirha, the wall of the forest, and the wall of the city, and I built the gates thereof, and I built the towers thereof, and I built the palace, and I made the prisons for the criminals within the walls. And there was no cistern in the walls as Kirha, and I said to all the people, make for yourselves every man a cistern in his house. And I dug the ditch for Kirha by means of the captive men. And it goes on about that. The story told by Mesha and the account given in the Bible supplement one another. Mesha delivered Moab from the yoke of the Israelites during the reign of Ahaziah and the successor of Ahab, and Joram, Ahaziah's successor, was subsequently driven out of Jahaz, and carries on. The chief interest attaching to the inscription in our eyes lies perhaps in the language and characters in which it is written. The language is almost exactly the same as that of the Old Testament. It shows that the dialect of Moab differed much less from Hebrew than does one English dialect from another. The very phrases recur which the Old Testament has made familiar to us, and at times we might fancy that we were listening to a chapter of the Bible. The characters, too, in which the text is written belong to a form of the Phoenician alphabet which must have resembled very closely that used by the Jews. We may thus see in them the mode of writing employed by the earlier prophets, and correct by their means the corrupt readings which the carelessness of copyists has allowed to creep into the sacred text. Since the discovery of the Moabite stone, another early inscription has been found in Jerusalem itself, which shows us precisely how the books of the Old Testament, which were composed between the time of David and the Babylonian captivity, must have been originally written. This is the Siloam inscription engraved in the rock-cut tunnel which conveys the water of the Virgin Spring, the only natural spring in or about Jerusalem, to the pool of Siloam. Its strange position in a dark underground conduit through which the water was perpetually flowing caused it to remain unnoticed until 3 or 4 years ago, prior to this book being written and published. Even after the discovery, the water had to be lowered in the calcareous deposit. Maybe it had a lot of calcium or something in it, or something. I'm not too sure what that word actually is referring to, with which the characters were filled to be removed before the inscription could be satisfactorily read. It runs as follows. Then he gives this inscription. So basically this book is about proving the Bible with these historical records from these different nations. If the history is a medley of myths and legends, where are the foundations upon which Christianity was to build? If the prophecies were the composition of a later age than that to which they profess to refer, what becomes of the testimonies to which our Lord himself appealed? Happily, we are not called upon to answer these questions. The long buried stones have been disinterred to cry out against the assailants of our faith. The long forgotten empires of the ancient East have arisen out of the grave of centuries to testify to the truth of the oracles of God. There's something interesting here about the Jews. It will be seen that the argument of this tract, or this particular book, has so far been a positive one. We have endeavoured to show by the aid of contemporaneous monuments that the Jews and their neighbours were not the barbarous and illiterate people objectors to the truth of the biblical narrative have tactically assumed them to be, and we have further pointed out the agreement between the biblical narrative and these contemporaneous monuments, wherever they come into contact with one another. But the argument would not be complete unless we add to it a negative one. We have to show that the statements contained in the than books later in date, then the events which they profess to record are not only inconsistent with the evidence of the monuments, but are frequently contradicted by it. Books like those of Talbot and Judith, on the one hand, or the history of the ancient East, preserved in classical writers, on the other hand, will not be the test of an appeal to the native inscriptions. Their statements are frequently irreconcilable with the facts obtained by modern Egyptian and Assyrian research, and they betray their late origins and various small inaccuracies. Let us take, for example, the Book of Talbot. Talbot is said to have been carried captive to Nineveh, along with his brethren of the tribe of Naphtali, by the Assyrian king Enemesar, whose son and successor was Sennacherib. But Naphtali, as we have seen throughout this book, was really carried into captivity by Tiglath-Pileser, who was in no way related to Sennacherib, and between whom and Sennacherib there was an interval of 2 reigns and 22 years. So is it saying that Talbot, etc. are incorrect? The author of the Book of Talbot knew nothing of Sargon. A misinterpretation of the passage in the Book of Kings relating to the fall of Samaria had led him to imagine that it had been captured by Shalmaneser, and as Sennacherib was the next king of Assyria, whose name appeared in the historical books of the Old Testament, he jumped to the conclusion that Shalmaneser had been his father and immediate predecessor. Talbot is further made to assert that Sennacherib's murder took place only 55 days after his return from his disastrous campaign in Palestine. Here again, the author of the apocryphal book has misinterpreted the Old Testament record and has accordingly been led into a grave historical error. So be very careful then of the Book of Talbot. The campaign in Palestine occurred in BC 701 and Sennacherib's death in BC 681, so that there was really an interval of 20 years between the two events. During this interval, Sennacherib engaged in several wars, though he did not again venture to attack Hezekiah, and we possess inscriptions of his in which he describes him. If we pass from the Book of Talbot to the Book of Judith and test its statements by the monuments, we shall find them equally false. It begins by alleging that Nebuchadnezzar ruled in Nineveh and Arphaxad reigned over the Medes in Ecbatana, but Nineveh had become a ruinous heap before Nebuchadnezzar had begun to rule anywhere, and he ruled not over Assyria but over Babylon. The contemporary king who reigned in Ecbatana was Sayce. Arphaxad is taken from the genealogy of Shem in Genesis 10. He may be the father of Eber, or Heber, Heber, whom the Hebrews were named after. These were the R word in the Hebrew, those who made a passage, those who crossed over and made a journey, those who ventured into Canaan, Abraham, etc. The wars carried on by Nebuchadnezzar, as described in the Book of Judith, are mere fictions of the imagination. His conquest of Ecbatana and capture of its rulers had as little foundation in fact as the assertion that he returned to Nineveh, and so forth. So you'd have to be very, very careful of the Roman Catholic Apocrypha then. If these books, Talbot and Judith, are giving you false information way back in the days when this particular writer or interpreter translated it, as it says here in this book. The Book of Judith, mere fictions of the imagination, and Book of Talbot, completely wrong. And when confronted with contemporaneous monuments, Herodotus, that's the supposed father of Greek history, and Sayce alike turns out to be false guides. So you have to be careful of them as well. And it has a note here, has mentioned here. Hence it is that apocryphal books, like those of Talbot and Judith, are so full of errors and anachronisms, and thus show plainly the lateness of their composition and the unhistorical character of their contents. So be very, very careful of those apocryphal books. If you like this video, then give us a like, subscribe to our channel, add your comments below the video. We'll get back to you on those as soon as we can, and then go share this with all your family, friends and others, especially this point in relationship to the Roman Catholic apocryphal books like Talbot, Judith, etc., that they are in error. They may not, these Roman Catholics may not be aware of it or remain totally ignorant of it. But you can show them this video, this particular book. Go to this particular website. We'll put the link in the description box. You can go have a look at it. You can possibly download it and read it for yourself, and perhaps show them their inconsistencies. These books are incorrect or false. Talbot, Judith, and so forth.